In many ways, the 2022-2023 NBA season was unprecedented. There were so many crazy things that happened in that season. I'm going to tell you why this upcoming year is going to be much different than the season that we just witnessed. First and foremost, you have to think about what the league looks like this year compared to last. When you look at the entirety of each conference, there are so many highly competitive teams. Even if they're not going to be 50-win teams, there's a lot of teams you could easily see winning 35, 40, even 45 games. There's so much talent. There's so many, even on these younger teams, so many groups that you could easily see one thing goes their way, and they could be the Kings from last season, where suddenly you're looking up and like, hey, how is Oklahoma City the 4th seed in what is a very crowded Western Conference? There's so much talent, and both conferences are incredibly competitive, specifically the Western Conference. And that's different than last year because at least 10 to 12 teams went into the season last year knowing they weren't really trying to be all that good. Like, they wanted to be competitive in the beginning of the season. They were going to see what their team looked like. For example, a team like Utah that ended up being better than everybody expected for the first few months before cooling down towards the end of the season. There were always going to be some teams that were going to, feel some things out before tanking. But the emphasis last year, if you were one of those teams that wasn't a title contender, really was, let's give ourselves the best chance that we can at landing someone like Victor Wembanyama in the draft. Like, his presence was felt so heavily throughout the entirety of the season because teams wanted to give themselves as good of a chance of getting him as they could because he was arguably the best NBA draft prospect of all time. San Antonio ends up with him, and part of the reason they ended up with him was because they traded away DeJounte Murray in the offseason prior. They actively tried to lose games during the year to give themselves the best odds, and that situation that we saw last year not only was unprecedented in terms of the amount of teams that are tanking, but is not going to be the case this upcoming season. This 2024 NBA draft class, as of now, things can always change, does not look very good. And so that idea of tanking, intentionally trying to lose games, trying to be bad from top to bottom, potentially in the conference, like, that's just not going to be a thing. There are going to be some teams towards the end of the year that are going to intentionally lose games because they realize that they're not very good. That happens every year, but it's not going to be 10 teams. It might only be 3, 4, 5 teams. And when you look at these conferences, there are so many teams that didn't make the playoffs last year or made the play-in game and just barely snuck into the playoffs that are incredibly talented. I mean, think about in the West, you've got a team like Oklahoma City that didn't make the playoffs but was much better than people expected last year. Now they're getting Chet back. They've added some other guys. Their key players are going to continue to improve. They could easily be the 4th seed in the West this upcoming season. Minnesota is a team that everybody's written off because they don't like Rudy Gobert, and I don't like the construction of the roster a ton either, but they still managed to be competitive last year. If they have a fully healthy Karl-Anthony Towns and Anthony Edwards continues to improve and all these different guys, like, they could be a top 4 team in the conference. And then you look at a team like Dallas that, on paper, you're like, okay, they're gonna be good, right? Like, they had a good offseason. They were able to bring back Kyrie. They should have made the playoffs last year. They just made a big midseason trade with Kyrie and then intentionally lost last couple of games to keep their first round pick. They've added a ton of guys. You think, okay, well, they're going to be one of the top teams in the West. They could miss the playoffs. Like, the way that it's going to work in each of these conferences is 13, 14 teams are going to be legitimately competitive in terms of trying to get into the play-in tournament. And a couple of injuries here or a stretch of bad luck here in terms of shooting could easily turn a team that should be a top 6 team into a play-in or even out of the postseason team. And that is in such contrast to what we saw last year because of how much of a factor tanking was within the season a year ago. And to me, that's really exciting because, again, I keep talking about these younger teams, but there's going to be a team in either conference that we don't think of right now as a playoff or a play-in team that's going to make a leap. Like, Houston could make a leap this year. We could change our minds completely about what we think of the future of their roster, depending on what they do this upcoming season. We could have Atlanta randomly come out of nowhere and be one of the better teams in the conference because the East is really weird at the top with what's happening with Philly, and then, maybe some weird vibes with Boston, with Jaylen Brown, and then, Milwaukee, maybe they're getting older. Like, the East is going to be pretty wide open. We got to keep an eye on what's going to happen in Cleveland because if they're not successful, maybe we're looking at Donovan Mitchell getting traded again. They've got, their core of young guys, and Donovan Mitchell is the new guy that they added in. Maybe they could be a top 2 team or they could be a play-in team. Orlando is a team that I think is unbelievably talented in the Eastern Conference and could easily jump up into the top 6 and not even have to worry about the play-in, or they could just win 37 games again. Like, there's so many teams that are in in that like Orlando, Houston category where, yeah, you wouldn't be surprised if they only won 28 games again this year, but you also wouldn't be surprised if they're fighting for the play-in at the end of the season the way that Oklahoma City was last year. And one of those teams is going to make it. Like one of those teams is going to jump up, and a team like Dallas, like Atlanta, like Toronto, maybe, that we just assume are going to be in the postseason, they're going to miss it. And that's what's so intriguing and so interesting to me about this season is there's so much less incentive to be bad. Like the difference, I cannot overstate the difference between last year's draft class and this year's draft class in terms of your incentive to be bad. That could change during the year. There could be some guy that blows up and is an unbelievable in college or overseas, and all of a sudden he's the consensus #1 pick or in the G League. But I cannot overstate how much of a difference that has in terms of how much of a difference that makes, I should say, in terms of what your goals are going into the season if you're Detroit or San Antonio or Houston. And that's just going to make for such a more competitive league, in my opinion, this year, because there have been times over the last few seasons, and more specifically last year, where things were so non-competitive towards the end of the year that it was really tough to even turn on any of the games and watch, because it was just like I'm watching like G League teams out there because teams are intentionally trying to lose. I don't think that's going to happen this year. Like if you're Orlando or Detroit or Houston or San Antonio or Oklahoma City and you're within 3 games of the play-in with a handful of weeks to go, like you're going to really be trying to win those games. I don't think those first round picks are going to be seen as nearly as valuable for any of those teams if they have a real legitimate chance to make the play-in and make the playoffs. And I'm telling you, it's going to happen for one of these teams. No matter, I'm going to do a power rankings for every team in the league here coming up. No matter where you think they fall in those power rankings, like things change during the year, midseason trades, injuries, just bad luck, teams being better or worse than you thought. And it's going to happen for one of those quote unquote lower level teams. And it could completely change everything about the future of their franchise. That could be their like Phoenix Suns in the bubble moment, where the Suns go to the bubble, they win every single game, they for some reason don't make the playoffs, but that catapults them into getting Chris Paul and making these other moves. And now of course they have this crazy team that they have, but that's all it really takes is for one of these teams to make that kind of a run, make the play-in, make the playoffs, and all of a sudden you're legitimized, not only in your fan base's eyes, but in the eyes of all these other players around the league. And suddenly you're a destination. You're not just an interesting, young, talented team, but you're a destination team. And that is such a huge difference between what we saw last year and what we're going to see this year, just because no one's going to want, teams are going to want the first pick in the draft, but they're not going to want it nearly as bad as they did last year. And this kind of season, in my opinion, is why the NBA implemented the new lottery odds and they implemented the play-in tournament, because in these kinds of years, you shouldn't be tanking towards the bottom. Like when you know the draft class isn't as good, this should be a season in which you really push for things. But if you're, Houston or Orlando and you're 5 games out of the 8 seed with 2 weeks to go, like you're not really going to be trying to win games. But if you're 2 games out of the play-in and have a chance to play in what's kind of a legitimate playoff game with a crazy environment, that could be really helpful to your young team. And this, I think, is going to really prove that point of why the NBA implemented those things in the first place, to try and, take away tanking. Whereas last year it seemed like, okay, they made all these changes and everybody's still tanking all the time. Yes, but last year was an unprecedented situation in terms of who is at the top of that draft. And that's just not going to be the case this year. And I cannot wait, not only for the season to get started, but see how all these changes that the league has made to try and prevent teams from tanking, see the proof of concept this year. Because if it doesn't happen this year, then all the changes they made basically were for nothing.